Jobs. We hear a lot from industry about jobs, and so I decided to go in and start pulling jobs numbers a while back and look, and even look at some of the economic models that produce these glorious jobs numbers that we hear from industry. And what I found were a couple of very interesting things. I'd like to start out with the jobs reports from industry, because anybody who's taken Economics 101 knows that economic models are only as good as their inputs. And these job numbers that you hear from industry touting that they're going to produce 600,000 jobs by 2020 or 200,000 jobs in Ohio alone, all of those numbers have come from economic models. They're mere projections. And so you can essentially go in and reverse engineer these models and have your inputs such that whatever job number you hope to have at the end of the day, you can make that happen. And the other interesting thing that we found was that when you go in and you start parsing out some of these jobs, what we found was that industry was claiming jobs like strippers and prostitutes in the mix. Now, admittedly, that is job creation, but it's not the sort of job creation that you or I think about when we hear these glowing jobs numbers. Now, looking at this slide, what I wanted to do was I didn't want to take the direct and indirect numbers, which is what industry does. I wanted to leave out the strippers and the prostitutes, in other words. So I went into the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and all these numbers, by the way, come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I wanted to see what were the actual direct industry jobs, just the people who are directly day-to-day employed by industry. And what I found was that oil and gas had at the end of 2011 approximately 181,000 direct industry jobs. Renewables, and in this I'm only counting wind, solar, and geothermal. I left out all the other renewables, but wind, solar, and geothermal had approximately 183,000 direct industry jobs. And so they're roughly equal, but you can't stop there. You have to keep going with this. So I wanted to look and see what was the total energy generation capacity for electricity from oil and gas, and I found that about 45% of our total electricity generating capacity comes from oil and gas, whereas from renewables, excuse me, it's only about 15%. But as you can see, what's interesting about these numbers is that renewables are creating significantly more jobs per kilowatt than oil and gas. I personally think that this is a statistic that is not lost on the senior executive management teams of oil and gas companies, and that is why we see advertisements on television every 5 minutes telling us, extolling to us how many jobs industry is creating, because they know actually that they're not creating as many jobs as the renewable industry. Now, this is sort of interesting because a lot of people don't realize that the majors themselves, the Shells, the Exxon Mobils, the Conoco Phillips of the world, they are actually struggling, and they have been struggling for over a decade. How are they struggling? Well, they have not been able to materially increase production replacement excuse me, in over a decade. And what that means is that if you're an oil and gas company, again, one of the primary metrics that analysts use and investors is we want to go in and we want to look. Are you able to increase this production? Are you able to increase your reserves, replace your reserves? Because if you aren't, you're on a downward slope, essentially. And that's precisely what has happened with the majors. They have not been able to materially increase reserves. And in fact, if you went in and looked at the reserve replacement ratio for ExxonMobil, for instance, in 2012, Exxon announced that 40% of all their reserve replacement for one of the world's largest oil and gas companies is coming from two shale gas plays, the Bakken and the Woodford. And that's interesting because the Woodford only has 2 rigs running, essentially, and has been in decline. The Bakken, we now know from actual data filed by the industry with the North Dakota Oil and Gas Commission, we know that the per well production in the Bakken peaked way back in June of 2010. Now, the number of wells has more than doubled since that time, but per well production has not increased. So that's troubling. That's a very troubling trend. And so we know that the majors are struggling. Recovery efficiencies. This is quite interesting because if you go in and look at recovery efficiencies for conventional oil and gas fields, you'll find that you can typically count on recovering about 75 to 80% of the total gas or oil in place in those fields. Whereas the recovery efficiencies for the 5 major shale gas plays average 6.5%. They run from between 4 and 10% and average 6.5%. So the recovery efficiencies are quite dismal. Energy returned on energy invested. If you look at, Richard touched on this briefly in his presentation, if you look at how much energy you're expending to get energy out, we look at that as a ratio, a very simple ratio. So those numbers, in the early days of crude, we expended 1 barrel of crude, the equivalent of 1 barrel of crude, to get 100 barrels of crude out. So that was a pretty good ratio. Today, we're expending 1 barrel of crude to get approximately 11 barrels out. But when you get into these unconventionals like tar sands and shale oil, it becomes much more dismal. You're expending 1 barrel of crude to get 3 barrels of tar sands out. And while we haven't completed the work, the scientists that are working on this have not completed the work on shale oils, it's looking very much as though shales are going to come in less than 5, probably around 4 to 5 to 1. So you've got this troubling dependence on low EROEI fuels. You've got a troubling dependence on reserve replacements coming out of fields that are known to have very steep declines, and you have a troubling, dismal recovery efficiency. Now, moving into some of the externalities of shales, we went in and started pulling numbers on, excuse me, on severance tax revenues that have been given to states or paid to states by the oil and gas industry, because the industry speaks a lot about we pay, huge amounts of money in severance tax revenue, and this is an economic boon to state coffers. Well, they do pay a lot of money, but it has not been the boon that industry would like us to believe it is. And if you just look at one of these metrics, just road damages alone, and I've lost my slide here, there it is. As you can see, if you look in 2012, the state of Texas, and this is for all severance tax revenue, onshore and offshore, conventional and unconventional in Texas. Texas took in about $3.6 billion, but the road damage alone onshore, just in the Haynesville, Bakken, and the Permian Basin, Haynesville, Eagle Ford, Barnett, and Permian Basin, equals about $4 billion. So we've got a shortfall there of about $400 million. Arkansas, this is a cumulative revenue figure, severance tax revenue figure. Since 2009, the state of Arkansas has taken in $182 million, but the road damages from drilling are estimated by ARCDOT to be $450 million. Pennsylvania, unfortunately, did not institute a severance tax, and that was very foolish indeed by their political leadership. They did go in 2012 and start an impact fee, and they've taken in approximately $204 million, but PennDOT estimates that the road damages from drilling are about $3.5 billion. The same thing has happened in North Dakota. They've taken in, I believe the figure is about $1.3 billion in revenues, but the road damages are estimated to be $7 billion. So as you can see, the taxpayers are going to end up picking up these costs for road damages. They're not being covered by the industry that generated the damage to begin with, and the severance tax revenue is falling significantly short of covering just the road damages. And we haven't even talked about the cost for the environmental degradation, air problems. If you look at, we know that the shale gas wells in particular, but also oil wells, contribute to ozone formation, and if you look at crop damages from ozone formation, those fees and lost days of work, etc., hospitalization, they're coming up into the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars as well, and that's going to be added onto this, even though the severance tax revenue is not even keeping up with road damages. So there's a significant problem there. There's also a lack of confidence within the industry itself. I could go into several examples, but because we're a little bit pressed for time, I'll just give you my favorite one, which is One-Up Partners wanted to set up a pipeline to carry the crude out of the Bakken Formation and down to Cushing, Oklahoma. Now, this was very interesting to me because pipelines are very expensive. They have a very huge capital outlay up front, but once that capital outlay has been recouped, they turn into veritable money-making machines. As long as you have enough product to run through that pipeline system for decades. I think One-Up went in and tried to get partners within the industry to build this pipeline, and no one would pony up the money. And I think the reason for it was that the industry knows that these wells in the Bakken, they know that they've already peaked in per well production back in June of 2010, 3 years ago, and they know that this is not a long-lived exercise, and they don't feel confident enough that they will recoup their initial investment. So they announced with great fanfare and a lot of public relations spin that they would be shipping the crude by rail. The problem with shipping the crude by rail is that it costs 3 times as much as it costs to transport crude through a pipeline. So as you can see, there's a definite lack of confidence there by the industry that they will be able to recoup their initial investment. Shale exportation is being done for one reason and one reason only, and that is to salvage ailing balance sheets. It's very simple math. The companies are bleeding red all over their balance sheets. They cannot make money. You saw the free cash flow numbers. They're losing money hand over fist. And one way to stave off this bloodletting, I suppose you could say, is to send that crude or that gas, and in this case we're talking about primarily gas at this point, but there is now some rumblings about exporting our crude as well, but export that gas to markets where they will get paid a much higher price. To give you an example of this, natural gas prices for the moment in the U.S. are trading in a range of about $3.50 to $4 per MCF. That exact same amount of natural gas locked into a long-term contract in Asia, the Asians would be willing to pay these companies $18. We can extract, pipe, refine, and ship the gas to Asia, all fully costed, for about $9 and get paid $18, these companies can. So that spread is very lucrative indeed and would definitely help salvage the ailing balance sheets. This is not about economic benefits to local communities from shale exportation or even to the U.S. in general. It's strictly about salvaging the companies and getting them out of the red. To conclude tonight, I thought I would use this slide of my hometown because I think it so brilliantly illustrates the drilling treadmill that we in the financial community talk about so often when shales are involved. In 2008, the city of Fort Worth, Texas received $50 million in revenues from a mere 44 shale gas wells. Everyone around here was giddy. In fact, they coined the term that we were going to be shale-yonaires. But in a mere 4 years, and this is so classic, I could give you just dozens of examples that follow this exact same pattern. In a mere 4 years, and this decline was linear, from $50 million down to $23 million that the city received in revenues from gas. But now we have 397 wells within the city proper instead of 44, and yet a tenfold increase in wells essentially did not give us any greater revenue. In fact, our revenue dropped by 50%. And I think that's such a classic illustration of the drilling treadmill. So I've covered a lot of information, and I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions because people are going to think that there's some gaps there. But that's it for me, and I very much appreciate you all joining us tonight. Thank you.